everyone. I'm Nanci Ross. And when I first became acquainted with the SEB and my first meeting, I was actually as a graduate student working in the lowland tropical rainforest. But my research has taken me on the other side of the world. I actually now work in the Eastern Himalaya. And primarily, I've been studying climate change. And climate change in the Eastern Himalaya is quite important because the Himalaya is in an area of the world that, based on global wind patterns as well as just the sheer elevation of the Himalayas themselves, mean that the Himalaya is experiencing a faster rate of climate change than almost anywhere else in the world except for the Arctic. And this is important because the Eastern Himalaya is also a center of plant biodiversity. It is the most biodiverse temperate ecosystem on the planet. And this diversity is encapsulated in the plant species. The animals, I'm sure they're interesting, but there aren't really that many of them. And so, when you're looking at this along the different elevational gradients that exemplify an extreme montane environment like the Himalayas, you're going to see that this is what is one of the main determinants of this high diversity, is these extreme gradients. And when you study earlier studies about the diversity and species richness along these gradients have shown this diversity across the gradient. However, the really interesting part is that the highest diversity and plant species richness is actually found in the Alpine, these high elevation areas of the Himalaya. And the Alpine is defined as the area above the tree line, which is basically higher than any trees can grow, all the way up to just below permanent snow line. And in the Himalaya, this is roughly between around 3,000 to 5,500 or 6,000 meters. And in addition to the fact that this area has an enormous diversity of species, it is also found to be very important ethnobotanically, because more than 65% of the plant species, plant forbs, I should say, in the Alpine are actually medicinal species. So what you result here is that not only are the Alpine important as being centers of plant diversity and richness, but they're also centers of diversity and richness in useful plant species. So what impacts the Alpine is going to have both social and ecological implications. Now when you're doing work for climate change, generally you're looking for pristine or undisturbed environments. Basically no people are allowed to be studied up there. But on our way up to these peaks that were undisturbed, we had to pass through a lot of meadows. And those meadows were filled with yaks, which are insanely cute. Aren't they? They're like these curly-haired cows. And I would, first yaks, you can't really tell from this picture. The first yaks, you just want to go scratch their heads, but then you realize that they're huge. Yaks are enormous. They're way bigger than cows, and they have these forward-pointing horns, so they get less cute pretty quick. But when I was walking through these meadows, I did tend to start thinking, I'm like, wait a minute, a lot of these species that are exemplifying these high diversity alpine meadows, they're also found in these alpine yak grazing meadows as well. But what impact are the yaks having? I mean, this is a lot of disturbance being introduced by these yaks, and no one had really wondered what exactly are the yaks doing to where to find these species and how these species live about their lives. And so first thing I thought I'd do, well, I got to get out there and just see if I can even recognize the species. So, get my little pack on, I go up the hill, and I finally get up there and I sit down and I'm looking at these plants. And I'm crawling around on the ground because everything in the Alpine is about this big. And so up over the hill come some yaks, pretty normal, don't really pay much attention, but then up over the next hill comes a guy, a yak herder. And he stops and he sees me and looks like this because tourists tend to move in packs. And when he realized I was alone, he thought, oh, I wonder what she's doing. So he came over. And the local village is a yi village. My yi is a little rusty. So I'm completely incapable of speaking in yi. So he came over and he was clearly trying to ask me, what are you doing? And so I had to resort to gesticulations, which I'm pretty good at, and lots of pictures, showing him my pictures, and he thought this was very funny, and he makes this whoo sound. And then about, like a couple of hills over, which would have taken me an hour to walk, I see a head come up, and another herder, and he magically transports himself over in a short period of time. And the two of them are, and I have to explain to him what I'm doing, and they're laughing. But after a while, when they stopped laughing at me, it became obvious that they were trying to tell me something about what I was trying to know, where these things are at. And I thought, I should just go down to the village and just, just got me more of these yak herders there. They would be interested in what I'm doing, obviously, and I would like to talk to them. So I went down to the local village, and I started talking with the herders. And there was a young woman there, Shui, and she was very kind, and she agreed to be my translator as best we could. And so I basically started asking them originally, what plants are you collecting? And at first they thought I was interested in medicinal plants, but really what I was trying to figure out is, do you know where these plants are at, their distributions? I was more interested in, how these plants are distributed throughout the meadows. And because they're pragmatic, and they've already told me, they pretty much said from the beginning, if we don't use it, I don't really care where it's at. So what they told me pretty quick was that most plants in the meadows are medicines, so we pretty much know where they're all at. But one other really interesting thing that they did mention was that there has been, within the last 10 years or so, a recent increase in the number of yaks in the meadow, more than 1,000. Now every family in the village has yaks in the meadow, and some of the families from town have contracted some members in the village to herd some yaks for them out on in the meadows and the mountain. And so what they said was, we can't protect the yaks, or the meadow from the yaks. I mean, the yaks will eat anything. But we don't even have to try, because the plants protect themselves because they hide in the bush. And the bush is the rhododendrons. And so here is a picture of a typical alpine meadow, and we can see these low hummocks that are the lavender-colored flowers. Those are rhododendrons. And now, have all of you seen Sherlock Holmes, the recent Sherlock Holmes movie where he keeps poisoning the dog? Well, the first thing he poisoned the dog with was rhododendron. They're highly toxic. And so yaks who eat just about anything won't eat rhododendron. And so what you see is some of these plants tend to be peeking out from inside of the rhododendrons. And so what I thought is a way for me to quantify this question of the effect oops, things got switched, didn't it? The effect of this yak grazing on the distribution and the diversity of these alpine forbs. And secondarily, what effect might this have on the availability of these plants that the people were collecting in the area? And so my hypothesis was that the species composition of forb species are going to be significantly different inside versus outside of rhododendron shrubs. So how did I go about this? Well, my site was at Yulong Mountain, and this is in northwest Yunnan province in China, same area as Mary was working. And so this is in the Eastern Himalaya. You can see a red star on the map there. This is an area that has even greater topographic diversity than even some other areas because of the fact that 3 of the major Asian rivers, the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Salween River, all originate in this area. So they cut through there, creating these huge biogeographic gradients. Now on the mountain, I had 3 different alpine meadows on 3 aspects of the mountain, the east, west, and the south. And each of these plots was actually a paired plot that was divided into 4 sections. There was the shrub edge, which is area A here. And so on the shrub edge, that basically is that interface zone between the shrub and the open meadow. And then B is fully inside of the rhododendron shrub. And so then this is a 20 by 20 centimeter quadrat. And so then what I would do is I would flip it 180 degrees out into the meadow and do a second paired set of censuses on C and D out in open meadow. So you get a total of 364 plots. I found 7,081 individuals from 24 families and 58 species. So it's quite a bit up there. It's rather remarkable. Okay, first question. Like I told you, my meadows are on different aspects of the mountain. All right, so meadow 1's on the east, meadow 2 is on the west, and meadow 3 is on the southern aspect. So the first question before I can do anything is to find out if my meadows are different. So first thing I did was run a non-parametric ordination called an NMS. And this is just a way to help me observe my data, to look at the relationships between the plots and the meadows. Meadow 1 is in green, 2 is in blue, and 3 is in teal. And what you can see from this is there is a great deal of overlap, but it does look like there is some separation between the meadows. One other thing you might notice, however, is the really high stress value on this NMS. When you run an ordination like this, a stress value above 0.15 generally means that your ordination is iffy. But despite the fact, I still thought it would be important for me to further investigate any differences. So I ran an analysis of similarities. This is a non-parametric equivalent of an ANOVA, investigating differences, variation within and between your a priori defined groups. In this case, it was on the meadows, and I used the sections A, B, C, and D as my replicates within meadows. And what I found from that is that, yes, in fact, there is a significant difference. In ANISIM, what it does, it takes your data, randomizes it 999 times. It creates that blue distribution, which is the null. So an R value around 0 means there's no difference between your groups. Then it plots your data onto the distribution and gives you a p-value. So it's a highly significant difference between the meadows. So there is a significant difference in species composition. So before I can address my question of in shrub versus out of shrub, I got to pull that out. So what I did was ran another analysis called a nested ANOVA, or ANISIM. And so basically this is just a way of incorporating that meadow difference in there and then pulling it out, and so I can just section out the differences between the A, B, C, and D sections. And so even after removing differences between meadows, what you can see here is that, again, there is a significant difference between the sections. So species composition of plants inside of the rhododendrons is totally different from the species, not totally, but it's very different from the composition outside in the open meadow. All right, and so I ran an indicator species analysis just to get an idea of what species are we talking here. And so again, B is the inside the shrub section, A is on the edge, that transition zone, and C and D are out in the open meadow. And what is really interesting with this, if we look at those two species, Ligonum curvostylum and the campanula species that are significant indicators, this means that they are statistically significant for being found inside of the rhododendron. Those species, when I had spoken with the herders, were species that they had specifically said were found only in the bush. And when I ran an ANOVA on just those species themselves, again, this was further confirmed. They were significantly correlated with being in the bush as opposed to being outside the bush. Same thing again, the species Gentiana heterostema. That was a species that when the herders had mentioned it as being a plant they found useful, they said, that's found, it grows in the grass. Out in the grass is the open meadow where the yaks feed. So again, ANOVA further confirmed this, showing that Gentiana is strongly correlated with the open meadow and not with living in the bush. Now the second thing about this is that this was in early spring, this project. Well, early spring in the mountains is June. But one other thing is that you had a subset of these species which were flowering. And so one interesting thing is some of these species were found both in and out of the bush, but the ones outside of the bush either weren't flowering or the flowers have been bitten off. And so one thing, this is going to require some further research, but I did have some preliminary data on flowering. And so what I did was I just took the flowering individuals and compared my 4 sections, A, B, C, and D, in the bush and out of the bush. And what I found was that the transition zone, which is A, and then C and D, which are the open meadow, they heavily overlapped. I didn't see anything significantly different between them in terms of this ordination. But what you can see is that red grouping, which is the inside the bush plant community. And they are separating out. And so there is a hint here that flowering can be a second reason why some of these species, even if they are found both in and out of the bush, their reproductive success might actually be dependent on the bush. And so this is, another exemplar of this is the Cardamine procetiana, which is in the Brassicaceae. This was a species, again, that the herders had told me was found in the bush. And when I ran an ANOVA of the individuals, yes, it was significantly correlated with the bush. But when I looked at just the flowering individuals, 100% of all flowering individuals were found in the bush. There wasn't a single individual flowering outside of the bush, which is pretty suggestive. I'm not saying it's a guarantee here, but kind of cool. All right. Now, one of the herders sort of gave me his sort of view of things, and he said, look, there are 3 kinds of plants. There are herbs, which are the medicinals. There are fodder plants, and then there are nature protection plants. And the rhododendrons are in the nature protection category. Okay, these are species which are adapted to high pasture. They keep the environment healthy, both for the plants and for the yaks. And so they don't manage the landscape, but rhododendrons are doing it for them. Nothing protects the meadows except the rhododendrons and the junipers. But with things like climate change, is that going to stay? Is that going to remain constant? So like I said, climate change is happening very quickly at this elevation in this area of the world, and these plants are being forced higher and higher up the mountain. So as they're being struggling to find their place in this area, and when you introduce a whole another layer of increasing yak herding on the mountain, this sort of brings into question the security of this area. So this is something that I'm going to continue in the future. So thank you very much.
One quick question while the next speaker gets set up. One quick question.
Are there any other grazing animals besides the yaks up there that might be destructive?
No.
Thanks.
No, there aren't. Like I said, yeah, animals aren't really interesting. No, there are not actually any other grazing animals up that high. There are cattle lower down, closer.